1931. Durango. Brown water, silent couplers, sandy bank. A tin whistle rests in the boxcar coupling, still warm. Footprints walk into the current, heel first, as if going home. If the boy never returned by dawn, who made the ferry clerk stamp his pass an hour after the search began? The river bends just past the siding where freight cars used to stop before the line shifted south and left the tracks to rust in silence. The water runs quiet here, slow enough to catch reflections of the empty boxcars and the cottonwoods that lean toward the current, like old men watching something they cannot name. Boys fished from the pilings when the water was low, and one of them, a thin child with dark eyes and a habit of whistling the same 3 notes over and over, came down to the bend on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the air still held the night's coolness and the sand along the bank showed no marks but his own. He carried a tin whistle in his shirt pocket, the kind sold at the general store for a few centavos, dented along one side where it had been dropped or stepped on. The shopkeeper remembered selling it to him the week before because the boy had counted out the coins twice to make sure he had enough. He played it poorly, the same 3 notes in sequence, never progressing to a fourth, as if he were stuck on the first line of a song he could not finish. The sound carried across the water in the mornings, thin and clear, and the men who worked the siding came to expect it the way they expected the freight schedule, though the trains no longer stopped. On that Tuesday, the boy walked down to the pilings just after dawn. The ferry clerk saw him from the shack where he kept the crossing logs, a small figure moving along the bank with a fishing line coiled over one shoulder. The clerk waved, but the boy did not wave back. He was looking at something near the water, his head tilted as if listening, and then he pointed toward one of the boxcars sitting idle on the siding. The door of the car stood open, a black rectangle against the weathered wood, and the boy walked toward it with the slow certainty of someone following instructions only he could hear. The clerk turned back to his ledger. When he looked up again, 10 minutes later by his pocket watch, the boy was gone. The fishing line lay on the sand where it had been dropped, still coiled, and the reeds along the bank moved in a wind that had not been there a moment before. The clerk called out, his voice loud enough to echo off the boxcars, but no answer came back. He walked down to the water and found the boy's footprints clear and deep in the wet sand, angling into the current at a steep slope, heel first, as if the child had been walking backward, or as if he had been pulled in facing the wrong direction. The prints went into the water and did not come out. The clerk waded in up to his knees, feeling along the bottom with his boots, but the riverbed was smooth and empty. He called again, louder this time, and 2 men from the siding came running. They searched the reeds and looked under the boxcar and walked the bank in both directions, but the boy was not there. One of the men noticed the tin whistle wedged into the coupling between 2 freight cars, stuck so tightly it took both hands to pull it free. The metal was warm, almost hot, as if someone had been holding it or breathing through it only moments before. The ferry clerk checked his logbook. At 9 in the morning, an hour before the search began, he had stamped a return pass for the boy, marking him as crossed and recrossed in the same entry. He did not remember doing it. The ink was fresh, still wet enough to smudge when he touched it, and his handwriting matched the other entries in the book, but he had no memory of the boy coming to the shack, or of lifting the stamp, or of writing the time. He showed the entry to the men from the siding, and they stared at it without speaking. By noon, a dozen men had gathered at the bend. They dragged the shallows with grappling hooks and long poles working in a line across the current, but they found nothing except a rope loop lying on a patch of wet sand near the pilings. The loop was perfect, a circle with no visible ends, as if the rope had been cut and fused back together, or as if it had been tied in a knot that had somehow disappeared. The rope was clean and new, not frayed or waterlogged, and it circled a small depression in the sand that might have been a footprint or might have been the mark of something heavier pressing down. One of the men picked up the loop and tried to find where the ends met, but his fingers could not locate a seam or a splice. He handed it to the others, and each man examined it in turn, running the rope through their hands, searching for the place where the circle closed, but the loop remained unbroken and smooth. They left it on the bank and continued the search. The boy's mother arrived in the afternoon, brought by a neighbor who had heard the news in town. She stood at the edge of the water and called her son's name, her voice high and raw, and the men stopped dragging and stood with their heads down until she finished. She asked to see the whistle and held it in both hands, turning it over, touching the dent along its side. She said the boy had been afraid of the boxcars, that he would not go near them because he thought they moved at night when no one was watching. She said he had woken her 2 nights before, claiming he had heard the boxcar doors sliding open and shut in a rhythm like breathing. The men looked at each other but did not argue. One of them pointed out that the freight cars had been sitting on the siding for 3 months without moving, that the doors were rusted half open and could not slide without force. The mother said her son had been certain. She said he had described the sound in detail, a long scrape followed by a ringing note as if the door were a bell being struck. She said he had wanted to stay home that morning, but she had sent him out because the weather was fine and he needed the air. At dusk, the wind dropped and the air turned cold. The men were preparing to leave when the boxcar door moved. It slid on its track, slowly closing halfway, and then it rang once, a deep note that hung in the stillness and faded only after several seconds. The men froze. No one had touched the door. No wind had pushed it. The track was level and the door had been open for months without moving. One of the men walked over and examined the hinges and the rollers, but he found nothing unusual. No fresh grease or loose fittings, only rust and dirt, and the smooth wear of old metal. They resumed the search at first light. The river was lower than it had been the day before, the water having dropped several inches overnight, and the bank showed new stretches of sand where the current had pulled back. The men worked methodically, dividing the area into sections and walking each one in silence. They found the boy's fishing line still coiled, and a single boot print near the reeds that matched his size but pointed in the wrong direction, the toe facing upstream as if he had been walking against the current, or as if he had been standing backward when the print was made. A telegraph arrived at the ferry shack that morning, delivered by a rider from the main office. The message was dated the previous day, Tuesday, and it read, "Boy crossed south at 0910, stop returned north at 1015, stop, no incident, stop." The clerk read it twice and showed it to the others. The timestamp on the return was an hour after the boy had disappeared, and the phrasing suggested he had completed the crossing and come back. But no one at the shack had seen him after he walked toward the boxcar. The clerk checked his logbook again and found the entry he had made without remembering, the ink now dry and permanent, confirming the same times as the telegraph. The mother asked if there was another ferry crossing nearby, another clerk who might have seen her son. But the men said there was only one ferry for 30 miles and only one clerk who kept the logs. She asked if the telegraph could have been sent in error, a message meant for another crossing or another day, but the writer said the message had been transmitted from the shack itself, sent by the clerk using the code he had been given when he took the job. The clerk said he had sent no message. The search continued through Wednesday. Men from town joined the effort, bringing longer ropes and a shallow draft boat that could navigate the reeds. They worked the current in both directions, dragging the bottom and checking the banks for signs of disturbance. But the river gave up nothing. The boy's father, who worked a ranch 15 miles east, arrived on horseback and joined the line of searchers without speaking. He waded into the water up to his chest and stayed there until the cold forced him out, and then he sat on the bank and stared at the boxcars with an expression the other men did not try to interpret. On Wednesday evening, a switchman from the rail yard came to the bend. He was an older man, gray-haired and soft-spoken, and he said he had heard about the search and wanted to tell the family something that might matter, or might not. He said that on Tuesday morning, just after dawn, he had been walking the tracks near the siding when he saw the river run backward. He said the current had reversed itself for the span of a prayer, maybe 30 seconds, and the water had flowed upstream with enough force to push debris against the pilings. He said he had watched a boy-sized shadow step out of the reeds and onto the ties, moving with the backward current, and then the water had resumed its normal flow and the shadow was gone. The men asked him why he had not reported this earlier, and the switchman said he had thought it was a trick of the light, or a reflection from the boxcars, something his eyes had invented because he had been working a double shift and was tired. He said he had not believed it himself until he heard about the boy. He said the shadow had been the right size and the right shape, and it had moved like a child walking carefully on uneven ground, and it had disappeared near the boxcar with the open door. No one laughed. The men stood in a circle and listened, and did not interrupt. When the switchman finished, the boy's father asked him to show exactly where he had seen the shadow, and the switchman walked to the ties and pointed to a spot 3 yards from the boxcar. The father knelt and examined the ground, running his hands over the gravel and the wood. and he found nothing except a small scorch mark on one of the ties, a black oval the size of a fist, as if something very hot had rested there briefly. The search was called off on Thursday morning. The men had covered every inch of the river and the banks, had dragged the water until their arms ached, had walked the tracks and examined the boxcars and questioned everyone who might have seen the boy. They had found the whistle, the footprints, the rope loop, the telegraph, the scorch mark. They had heard the door ring and the switchman's account of the river running backward. They had no body and no explanation. The theories came slowly, offered in low voices at the general store and the ferry shack and the rail yard. Some said the boy had drowned and the current had carried him downstream, past the search area, into deeper water where he would surface eventually, when the river allowed it. They pointed to the footprints angling into the water and said the rest was coincidence. The whistle left behind in haste. The rope loop something unrelated. The door moved by a gust of wind no one had felt. Others said a man had taken the boy, someone passing through on the freight line, and the search had been focused in the wrong place. They mentioned drifters and rail workers and said the telegraph and the logbook entry had been faked to cover the abduction. A smaller group suggested the river itself was responsible, that the current had taken the boy in a way that could not be explained by drowning. They spoke of undertows and sinkholes, and said the riverbed might hold cavities that could trap a body without releasing it, that the water might have pulled him down and kept him in a place the search had not reached. They did not explain the whistle or the backward current or the shadow on the ties, but they insisted the river was deeper than it looked and more dangerous than anyone admitted. A few men, mostly older, offered a different idea. They said the geography near the bend was wrong, that the water did not behave the way it should, that sounds carried strangely, and objects appeared in places they had not been left. They mentioned other incidents from years past, small things. A lantern found burning on a sandbar in the middle of the river. Footprints that started and stopped without crossing the water. A man who had sworn he saw the freight cars move without an engine. They did not call it supernatural, but they used words like unusual and not right, and said the area had a feeling that made animals nervous and kept birds from nesting. Should the ferry have closed with the next investigation underway? The railway company sent an inspector on Friday to examine the siding and the boxcars. He was a thin man with a clipboard who measured distances and took photographs with a folding camera, and he spent most of the day checking the couplings and the door tracks. He found the boxcar door in working order, the rollers clean despite the rust, and he noted in his report that the door could slide freely with minimal force if the car was properly leveled. He said the ringing sound was consistent with the door striking the frame at a particular angle, that it was not unusual for old freight cars to make noise when the temperature changed or the ground settled. The inspector examined the tin whistle and said it could have been wedged into the coupling by the boy himself, perhaps as a game or a way to mark his spot. He said the warmth was likely residual heat from the sun or from the metal expanding in the morning air. He examined the footprints and said they were consistent with a child walking into the water, that the heel-first angle could be explained by the slope of the bank or by the way the sand had shifted after the prints were made. He looked at the rope loop and said it was probably left by a rail worker or a fisherman, that the appearance of no visible ends was an optical illusion caused by the way the rope had been coiled. He asked about the telegraph and the logbook entry, and the clerk showed him both documents. The inspector said clerical errors were common, that the clerk had likely made the entry out of habit or confusion, that the telegraph had been misfiled or sent to the wrong office. He said there was no evidence of foul play and no reason to suspect anything other than an accidental drowning. He said the body would surface within a week or two, that the river always gave up its dead eventually. He closed his report and left on the afternoon train. The boy's body did not surface. Days passed, then weeks, and the river remained silent. The mother came to the bend every morning and stood at the water's edge, watching the current, and the ferry clerk stopped stamping return passes because he could not trust his own memory. The whistle was placed on a shelf in the shack where anyone could see it, and the rope loop was hung on a nail near the door, and both objects became part of the landscape, unremarkable and permanent. In late October, a surveyor arrived to map the area for a new rail line. He worked alone, walking the banks with a transit and a measuring chain, and he set up his instruments on the high ground above the bend. He spent 3 days taking readings and drawing lines on a topographic map, and on the third day, he noticed something that made him stop and recheck his calculations. The river, according to his measurements, was running uphill. The gradient was slight, barely detectable without precise instruments, but it was there. The water flowed from a lower elevation to a higher one, a physical impossibility that his equipment confirmed again and again. He checked his transit for errors, recalibrated the level, and took new readings from different positions. But the result did not change. The river between the bend and the siding ran against gravity, climbing an incline of 3 feet over a distance of 200 yards, and then it leveled out and resumed a normal downhill flow. The surveyor showed his map to the ferry clerk and asked if the river had always behaved this way. The clerk said he had worked the crossing for 12 years and had never noticed anything unusual, that the water flowed the same direction every day and never backed up or reversed. The surveyor said the measurements did not lie, that the topography showed a clear uphill gradient, and that the only explanation was a subterranean channel or a sinkhole that was feeding water into the river from below, creating pressure that forced the current to rise. He marked the anomaly on his map and noted it in his report, and he recommended that the rail company conduct further surveys before building near the bend. He said the ground might be unstable, that there could be cavities or voids beneath the surface that would compromise the foundation. He said the area should be avoided for construction purposes. He did not mention the boy or the search or the boxcar door, but when he packed his instruments and left, he looked at the river with an expression that suggested he was not entirely satisfied with his own conclusions. The clerk filed the surveyor's map with the other documents related to the case. He placed it in a folder with the telegraph, the inspector's report, and a copy of the logbook entry, and he stored the folder in a cabinet where it would not be disturbed. He did not show the map to the boy's family because he did not know how to explain it or what it meant. He kept working the ferry and stamping the logs and listening to the boxcar door ring in the evenings when the wind dropped and the temperature fell. In November, a priest from the church in town came to bless the water. The boy's mother had requested it, and the priest agreed even though he said he did not believe in curses or hauntings or rivers that misbehaved. He stood at the edge of the bend and read a prayer in Latin, and he sprinkled holy water on the current and asked God to bring peace to the boy and to the family and to the river itself. He said the prayer twice because the mother asked him to, and then he left without offering any other comfort. The men who had searched for the boy came back to the bend on certain evenings, not together but 1 or 2 at a time, and they stood on the bank and looked at the water as if expecting something to change. They did not speak to each other when they met there, but they acknowledged one another with small nods, and they stayed until the light faded and the cold drove them home. The switchman returned as well, though less frequently, and he always walked to the ties where he had seen the shadow and stood there for several minutes before leaving. Winter came early that year, and the river froze along the edges. The ferry stopped running because the ice made the crossing dangerous, and the clerk stayed in the shack and kept the logs up to date even though no one was crossing. He heard the boxcar door ring on clear nights when the temperature dropped below freezing, and he noted the sound in his logbook without comment, recording the time and the conditions as if it were weather. In December, a railway official came to inspect the siding. He was not the same man who had come in September, and he did not carry a clipboard or take photographs. He walked the length of the tracks and examined the boxcars, and he spent a long time standing in front of the car with the open door. He asked the clerk if anything unusual had been observed since the search, and the clerk said no. Everything had been quiet. The official said the company was considering moving the boxcars to another yard because they were not being used and were taking up space. He said the move would happen in the spring. The clerk asked if the boxcar with the open door would be moved as well, and the official said yes, all the cars on the siding would be relocated. The clerk nodded and said nothing else. The official left, and the clerk went back to the shack and wrote a note in his logbook. Boxcars to be moved spring 1932. He underlined the date twice. On a cold evening in late December, the switchman came to the bend and found the clerk sitting on the bank near the pilings. The 2 men had not spoken since the search ended, but the switchman sat down beside the clerk without asking permission, and they watched the river in silence for several minutes. The ice along the edges glowed faintly in the moonlight, and the current moved slowly beneath it, dark and smooth. The switchman said he had been thinking about the boy, about the way the river had run backward, and the shadow he had seen on the ties. He said he could not explain it, and did not expect anyone to believe him. But he wanted the clerk to know that he had not been lying or confused. He said he had seen what he had seen, and it had been real as the ground beneath them or the cold in the air. The clerk said he believed him. He said he had made the logbook entry without remembering it, that his hand had written the words and stamped the pass while his mind was somewhere else, and that he had no explanation for how that was possible. He said the telegraph had been real too, sent from the shack by someone who was not him, and the rope loop with no ends and the whistle still warm in the coupling. He said the surveyor's map showed the river running uphill, and the inspector's report had dismissed everything as coincidence or error, but the clerk did not think it was either of those things. The switchman asked what the clerk thought it was, and the clerk said he did not know. He said the area was wrong somehow, that the bend did not follow the rules other places followed, and that the boy had walked into something that could not be mapped or measured or explained by drowning. He said the river had taken the boy, but not in the way people understood taking. He said the current had opened for a moment, just long enough, and the boy had walked through, and then the current had closed behind him. The switchman said that sounded like a door, and the clerk said yes, it sounded exactly like a door. They sat in silence for a while longer, and then the switchman stood and said he needed to get back before the cold worsened. He walked to the tracks and paused near the boxcar with the open door, and he looked inside as if expecting to see something, but the interior was empty and dark. He touched the frame lightly, and then continued on his way. The clerk stayed at the bend until the moon was high and the ice had thickened along the banks. He thought about the boy walking into the water heel first, about the whistle wedged in the coupling still warm, about the ferry pass stamped an hour too late. He thought about the river running uphill and the surveyor's inability to explain it, about the shadow on the ties and the boxcar door ringing like a bell. He thought about all the small impossibilities that had accumulated around the bend, each one minor enough to dismiss but together forming a pattern that refused to resolve. He went back to the shack and checked the logbook one more time. The entry was still there, clear and permanent, and the telegraph was still filed with the other documents, and the tin whistle was still on the shelf where anyone could see it. He closed the book and turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, listening to the river move beneath the ice. In January, the boy's mother stopped coming to the bend. The clerk did not know if she had given up or if the cold had kept her away, but the bank was empty in the mornings when he opened the shack, and the reeds where the boy had disappeared stood frozen and brittle. The men who had searched no longer visited, and the switchman worked his shifts without walking the tracks near the siding. The bend returned to the quiet it had held before the boy came down to fish, a silence interrupted only by the wind and the occasional ring of the boxcar door. On a clear evening in late January, the clerk heard the whistle. It came from the direction of the bend. 3 notes played slowly, the same sequence the boy had practiced over and over without finishing. The sound was thin and distant, carried on air so cold it burned to breathe, and it repeated twice before stopping. The clerk stood at the door of the shack and listened, his hand on the frame, but the sound did not return. He walked down to the bend with a lantern, the ice crunching under his boots, and he stood at the spot where the footprints had angled into the water. The river was frozen solid here, a smooth surface that reflected the stars, and nothing moved except the wind pushing loose snow across the ice. He called out, his voice loud in the stillness, but no answer came back. He waited, the lantern swinging slightly in his hand, and then he heard the whistle again. 3 notes, faint and precise, coming from the direction of the boxcars. He walked to the siding, his breath visible in the cold, and he stopped in front of the car with the open door. The interior was dark and empty, the same as it had always been, but the sound seemed to originate from inside, as if someone were standing in the far corner playing the notes just loudly enough to be heard. The clerk raised the lantern and stepped closer, and the door slid shut with a long scrape and rang once, deep and clear, the note hanging in the air before fading into silence. The clerk stepped back. The door did not move again. He circled the car and checked the other side, but he found nothing unusual, only frost and rust and the old wood weathered gray. He returned to the front and stared at the closed door, and he thought about forcing it open, but his hands would not move. He stood there until the cold became unbearable, and then he walked back to the shack and wrote in the logbook. Whistle heard, at bend and siding. Door closed on its own. No other activity. He did not report the incident to anyone. He kept the logbook entry private and continued working the ferry when the ice broke in late February. The boxcars remained on the siding through the winter and into the spring, and the door stayed closed, rusted shut by the moisture and the cold. The company's plan to move the cars was delayed, then postponed indefinitely, and the siding was left abandoned. In March, the boy's father came to the shack. He had not visited since the search ended, and the clerk was surprised to see him standing in the doorway, hat in hand, his face thinner than the clerk remembered. The father asked if anything new had been found, and the clerk said no, the search had been thorough, and no trace of the boy had surfaced. The father nodded and said he had expected that answer. He said he had come to ask a different question. He asked if the clerk believed the boy was dead, and the clerk hesitated before answering. He said he did not know. He said the river had been searched, and the banks had been walked and the water had been dragged and no body had been found. But that did not mean the boy was alive. He said there were many ways to disappear, and not all of them ended in death, but he could not say which one applied to this case. The father asked if the clerk thought the boy had left, and the clerk said he did not think that was the right word. He said the boy had gone somewhere but not in the way people usually went, and that wherever he had gone, it was not a place anyone could follow. He said the footprints had walked into the water as if the boy were going home, and the whistle had been left behind as if he no longer needed it, and the ferry pass had been stamped as if he had completed a crossing. The father stood in the doorway and did not respond for a long time. Then he said he had heard the whistle too, late at night when he could not sleep, 3 notes played over and over. He said his wife had heard it as well, though she refused to speak about it. He said the sound came from the direction of the river, but when he went outside to listen, it stopped. He asked if the clerk thought the boy was trying to communicate, and the clerk said he thought the boy was learning the first line of a song, just as he had been before he disappeared. The father thanked the clerk and left. The clerk watched him walk back toward town, a small figure against the gray landscape, and he thought about the way the boy had pointed at the boxcar before vanishing into the reeds. He thought about the door sliding shut and ringing like a bell, and the whistle still warm in his hands and the rope loop with no visible ends. He thought about all the ways a place could be wrong without announcing itself, all the small fractures in the ordinary that opened just wide enough for someone to slip through. In April, the first anniversary of the search passed without ceremony. The mother did not return to the bend, and the men who had dragged the river did not gather to mark the date. The clerk noted the day in his logbook with a single line: 1 year since the boy disappeared. River quiet. He closed the book and went outside to check the ferry ropes, and he saw the switchman standing on the tracks near the boxcar. The switchman waved and the clerk walked over. They had not spoken since the winter, and the clerk was surprised to see him there in daylight. The switchman said he had been reassigned to another yard, that his last shift at the siding would be the following week. He said he wanted to check the boxcars one more time before he left, to make sure nothing had been overlooked or forgotten. The clerk asked if he had found anything, and the switchman said no, the cars were empty, and the doors were sealed. He said the company had decided to leave them where they were, that the cost of moving them was too high for the value they represented. He said the siding would be decommissioned within the year, and the tracks would be pulled up and sold for scrap. He said the boxcars would remain until they rotted into the ground. The clerk said that seemed fitting. The switchman agreed. They stood together in the sun, the air warm for the first time in months, and they looked at the boxcar with the closed door. The switchman said he still thought about the shadow he had seen, the way it had moved across the ties as the river ran backward. He said he had tried to forget it, to convince himself it had been a trick of the light, but the memory refused to fade. He said he believed the boy had walked through something that morning, that the river had opened like a door, and the boy had stepped through without understanding what he was doing. The clerk said he believed that too. He said the surveyor's map had shown the river running uphill, and no one had been able to explain it, and the priest's blessing had changed nothing. He said the bend was a place where the rules did not hold, where water flowed against gravity and objects appeared in impossible configurations, and the boy had simply been there at the wrong moment or the right moment, depending on how one looked at it. The switchman said goodbye and walked back along the tracks, and the clerk returned to the shack. He sat at his desk and opened the logbook, and he read through the entries from the previous year, page after page of routine crossings and weather notes, and the occasional remark about the boxcar door or the whistle or the rope loop. He closed the book and placed it on the shelf with the others, and he wondered how many more entries he would make before the ferry closed, and the siding was torn down and the bend returned to the wilderness it had been before the tracks were laid. On certain evenings, when the wind falls and the couplers tick with the changing temperature, the whistle sounds from the bend. The notes are always the same, 3 in sequence, played slowly as if someone were learning the first line of a song. The sound carries across the water and echoes off the boxcars, and then it stops, leaving only the silence and the current moving beneath the surface. The clerk no longer goes to investigate. He writes the time in his logbook and continues his work, and he thinks about the boy walking into the water heel first, following a path only he could see. The rope loop still hangs on the nail near the door of the shack, perfect and unbroken, and the tin whistle still rests on the shelf where anyone can reach it. The surveyor's map remains filed with the other documents, showing a river that runs uphill for 200 yards before resuming its proper flow. The boxcar with the closed door sits on the siding, weathered and silent, its paint faded to gray. No one has opened it since the door slid shut in January, and no one plans to. The company has marked it for demolition, but the demolition never comes. The boy's parents moved away in late spring, leaving no forwarding address. The mother did not return to the bend before she left, and the father did not come back to the shack. The house where they lived stood empty for a season, and then it was sold to a family from another town who knew nothing about the search or the whistle or the river running backward. The new family did not stay long. They said the house felt wrong, that sounds carried strangely at night and the water seemed too close even though it was half a mile away. They left after 6 months, and the house has remained empty since. The men who searched for the boy have scattered. Some moved to other towns for work. Others aged and retired. A few died of natural causes. The ferry clerk is one of the last who remembers the search in detail, and he has grown older and quieter, spending his days at the shack and his evenings walking the bank. He no longer expects the boy to return, but he watches the water as if something might change, as if the current might reverse again and open the door it closed. The bend remains as it was, brown water and silent couplers and sandy bank. The pilings lean into the current, their wood softened by years of exposure, and the reeds grow thick where the footprints once led into the water. The boxcars rust in place, their wheels sinking slowly into the gravel, and the door that rang like a bell stays closed. The tin whistle rests on the shelf in the shack, its dent visible in the light from the window, and on certain evenings, when the air is still and the temperature drops, it sounds from the bend, 3 notes only, as if someone were learning the first line over and over. What opened at the bend that morning, and does it still wait for someone else to point at the boxcar? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.